COVID cases crop up near Muskoka. We chat again with Dr. Mark Cameron on Canada's COVID situation. And another look into how the G8 summit went in Muskoka. All that and more coming up right now. Welcome to Cogeco News for June the 23rd. I'm James Bowler with what's happening in your community. And we will start the cast off today with a quick update on the local COVID situation. Simcoe Muskoka District Health Unit has no new cases to report directly in Muskoka. However, there is another case reported on our southern border. A man in his 50s from Severn Township has tested positive for COVID-19. According to the health unit, it was community acquired. Now, last month, we had an opportunity to chat with a Canadian doctor working in the States, Mark Cameron, who was directly involved in research during the SARS epidemic in Toronto. Earlier today, I had an opportunity to chat with Dr. Cameron again to get his feelings on how Ontario and Canada are doing in terms of reopening the economy versus the viral infection rate here. Mark, I want to take you back to our original conversation. At the time when we talked about what was happening, there were some discussions about opening up the province again, opening up things in Canada again. And you immediately were showing some concern with that movement. So we're into the second opening now, stage two, I'm trying to think of the word here, of the economy opening. And just first impressions, Mark, do you think we're still moving too quickly here, or are we kind of on par with what's happening?
So first of all, let's look at how Canada's curve has been progressing. Canada did a terrific job controlling its peak infection rate and very quickly bent its curve, so to speak. And not only did Canada do that, they bent their curve and have come down the other side. Us in the US have been sitting at a plateau for weeks, whereas Canada has decreased its overall case rate every day consistently over the last few weeks. In fact, the US is starting to pile on new cases as we went back to normal a little too early and took off some very important limitations and public health guidelines. So right now, I remain optimistic that Canada and Ontario are taking the right path because the results are there. The curve is still decreasing. And this very thoughtful, gradual return to some of our daily activities or our daily practices or opening up parts of our businesses appears to be working for now.
So, Mark, there's a bit of a polar opposite happening in the States right now, as we just discussed before we jumped on here, and possibly some lessons for Canada to be learning. In you guys, the States have become an unfortunate example of what not to do, I think, in many situations. So just kind of run me through, Mark, what you believe are some of the worst case situations happening right now.
Yeah, so the states that have started to see a return to increased numbers, maybe even heading towards a new set peak, were some of the earliest that opened up, and some of the earliest that really didn't have a gradual peel off of the limitations, but pretty much went back to normal very quickly. Things like mask use, things like avoiding large groups of people, things like returning to businesses of particular risk, like bars and restaurants, things like going back to beaches and not maintaining social distancing. All of those things have accumulated a risk of transmission, and we're starting to see those numbers now. Now it's taken a few weeks because just because somebody is exposed say on a weekend like down here, Memorial Day weekend, or as part of some of the larger congregations that occurred throughout the protests that affected the US here for weeks. Those infections don't get caught right away. They don't become part of the numbers for up to a few weeks, because it takes time for people to show symptoms. It takes time to get them tested, and it takes time for those numbers to show up in our curves. And also, the infections that are caused by those infections, i.e. the infections that are passed on to secondary people, take even longer. So there is an echo effect on A, the exposure, and then B, when we can actually see those cases be recorded. Now, in Canada, we have to understand that that will be the case as well. Going back through these phased returns to normalcy are going to have impact, and we may not see that impact for a while. So we can't become complacent if our numbers continue to creep downward, that returning to some sense of normalcy is still working. We have to be prepared for bad days. We have to be prepared for some increases in numbers. And if those occur, we have to think about why they occurred, and then adjust our behavior accordingly. So my point here is, throughout these graduated return to normal type of lifting of restrictions, we have to watch the numbers carefully.
And don't forget to tune in tomorrow to hear more about Dr. Cameron's thoughts on a possible second wave and when we might actually see a vaccine coming through to the public. We are going to take our first break, but when we come back, a little more of an in-depth look into those possible tornadoes that came through Muskoka 2 weeks ago. Joining me now from Western University is David SILLS. David, thank you very much for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. Now, you are with the Northern Tornado Project through the university.
The Northern Tornadoes Project, I'm the executive director, and we're at Western University in London, Ontario.
So the reason we're talking to you is because you have been working, your group has been working on identifying tornadoes in areas like Muskoka, and most recently you were able to identify 3 separate tornadoes that seem to have happened on June 10th, about 2 weeks ago. So first of all, before we get into that, I just want to just quickly tell me about the process of what you do and how you do it.
Sure. Well, we know that there are tornadoes occurring in all parts of Canada, but we only tend to get reports from the more populated places. So the Northern Tornadoes Project, the mission is to get a handle on where all of the tornadoes are occurring. So our aim is to detect every tornado that occurs across Canada. And how we do that is when we can, we do ground surveys when we can get to that area. And then we can also run our drone and get really high resolution imagery in that area. But there's a lot of times that the tornadoes are occurring in the forest and we can't get there. So we use high resolution satellite imagery, and we even have aerial imagery from aircraft to get high resolution imagery so we can sort out what happens in the forest.
Okay, so let's talk about these tornadoes on June 10th. Now, as I understand, you were able to isolate Mary Lake, Baysville, and Bracebridge. So give me a quick overview of those, and again, how did you come to that conclusion?
Right, well, we did receive, that day there were reports all over Southern Ontario. And we did identify 2 tornadoes in Southwest Ontario earlier. That was Belmont and Glencoe. But we did have a lot of reports of tree damage up in Central Ontario. So we wanted to check those out. And once we got our satellite images in for that region, it became clear that there were 3 different tracks. So we have the Bracebridge track. That's a 5.6 kilometer track, maximum width about 120 meters. And we rated that at EF1, that's about 150 kilometers an hour. So there are more than 50% of a barn roof removed, horse shelter lofted and destroyed, intermittent tree fall along the path. That's the kind of damage that was experienced there. In Baysville, the tornado was exactly the same length, actually, about 5.6 kilometers, a bit wider at 140 meters. Again, EF1, mostly tree fall. In Mary Lake and near Huntsville, that was a bigger tornado. The length was almost 25 kilometers with that. It stretched even to Doughty. The maximum path width was over 500 meters with that, so a wide tornado. That was actually rated at EF2 because of a lot of trees actually were down along the path in the case.
So again, I want to talk a bit more about the Bracebridge one, because that one seemed to be a bit more confusing, I think, in terms of Environment Canada had originally thought it might be a downburst or a microburst, but you were able to really bring more attention to that. So my question too is, how do you work in conjunction with Environment Canada? Because I know you do. Obviously they don't, I guess maybe they just don't have all the tools or the ability to kind of look more in depth that you do.
Right. Well, that day we were expecting a lot of wind damage across Southern Ontario. That was kind of the thought that the storms were going to produce wind damage. And so when we got reports of wind damage, there was assumption that a lot of this was due to downbursts or straight line winds from these storms. So, we have to look more carefully in certain areas where it seemed the damage was more concentrated. And that takes time. So it took a week or 2 to go over some of these cases. Actually, we're still going through cases from that day to determine if it was a tornado or not. And at that point, Environment Canada is off looking at the next storm. So that's part of what NTP is about, is spending the extra time needed to clarify these events and make sure we understand if it was a tornado or not.
David, what does this information do?
Well, it's more getting an idea of how many tornadoes are occurring in certain areas. And you know that forecasters issue tornado watches and warnings. And if a tornado is not found, then that's a false alarm if there's no verification data. So now we can say, well, no, a tornado did occur in that area, that maybe a tornado warning was issued. And the forecasters might get more confidence in the warnings, especially tornado warnings, will improve. Mm-hmm. So that's part of the mission, is to try to improve the warning quality by improving the awareness of where tornadoes are occurring and improving the verification data. But it also provides data for insurance people looking at risk studies, municipalities who want to know the risk, and also data for people to work with in a research setting. So if someone wants to study tornadoes and why they occur in a certain place, then we've got data available to do that kind of thing.
But David Sills, Northern Tornadoes Project, thank you so much for taking the time, and we appreciate your research and helping us understand more about what we're seeing in our environment.
Great, my pleasure, James.
All right, we are going to take a quick break, and we will be right back after this. And once again, And once again, joining me now, this time from Rivermill Park, is my boss and colleague, Scott Acton. Scott, you can hear me?
I can hear you, James.
All right, so Scott, tell us what you're doing down at Rivermill Park today.
Well, yesterday on the program, James, we talked about this being the 10th anniversary of the G8 summit being held here in Huntsville. So all week long, I'm kind of talking to some of the characters from that time, and this afternoon I was able to have a conversation with former Mayor Claude Doughty.
And tell me a bit about how that conversation went. I mean, obviously he was a pivotal point in bringing this thing together. You know, what were some of the topics you guys talked about?
Well, we talked about how, you know, early on when we got word that hosting a G8 was a possibility and what that would mean for the potential for infrastructure. He talked a lot about the infrastructure projects that were built here. Of course, the Canada Summit Centre, the former Waterloo building, and just how, you know, we had to move pretty fast to get those pieces in place in order to host the World.
All right, well, we'll be interested to see what you have there. Let's take a look at that.
As soon as I got a whisper of what went on in Japan, which is that G8 had just completed, and they had they'd built a big facility in a parking lot of a ski hill for all the media. Well, thankfully, when my term started, we did quite an exhaustive analysis in the community of what infrastructure we needed. So I went to Tony, I said, we've got the plan. Here's all the infrastructure we need. We can build this summit center that can be the media center, and we won't tear it down when we're done. It'll be, you know, a legacy piece for the community, et cetera, et cetera. And with a few more twists of his arm, I was able to persuade him that we needed a significant fund, and it ended up at $40 million. And by the time we got that approved, it was February. And so we were 15 months away from the G8 when we decided to go. And so we designed and built all of the infrastructure that you see today in that time period. So it was busy. Oh, for me, it was worth it. You know, when I walk into those facilities now and you know, just with my hat on, having a peek around and seeing how many thousands of hours, you know, members of our community use those facilities, to me, that's worth it.
Well, Scott, that was some really interesting perspective from the former Mayor Doughty. Again, you know, really giving us an idea of what it was like to bring this together. Well, what were some of your thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things I did ask him was, you know, for him, what was the highlight as he reflects back this week, and you know, what's that first thing that comes to mind? And for him, it was a meeting with then President Barack Obama. Let's take a look at that clip.
And we did. We were in the receiving line. We received all the foreign dignitaries over the night before and the following morning, and we met President Obama, and I told him about my wife attending his inauguration, and there was some warm exchanges as a result of that discussion. Years later, when he's in Huntsville, and the mayor's wife had attended his inauguration, so it was pretty cool. One of the other highlights for me was the painting that we had at the Summit Center, and they all got to do some brush strokes. And I thought that was quintessential Huntsville. You know, here's all these world leaders all wanting to get their turn on the paintbrush to paint a few strokes on the mural. So it was great.
That's great, Scott. Well, thanks for showing us those clips. And as I understand, you do have some other little tidbits coming up this week in celebration of the G8.
Yeah, that's right, James. So tomorrow we'll speak with former MP Tony Clement. He'll reflect on his involvement. Of course, he was in the Harper government when the G8 did come to Huntsville back 10 years ago. And later in the week, we'll be looking just at some more clips. I've been digging through the archives the last few days. Lots of interesting clips from 10 years ago here in Huntsville.
Scott Acton reporting from Rivermill Park. Thank you again, Scott.
Thank you, James.
All right, we are going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this. Welcome back. Muskoka residents looking to get fit during these stressful times now have an opportunity to take their workouts outside and, more importantly, in groups.
We're going to start with some tire flips. Well, I think at first, when it first came in, it was overwhelming, not just for us, but obviously for everyone. You're kind of in a state of shock. So the first 2 weeks, I think we were just trying to get by. And what we were managing on doing is just holding some online classes free, just to make sure that people were still like staying somewhat consistent with their routine. Because I think that's where everybody kind of just fell off, was I'm in survival mode. I'm going to eat. And that's okay, because everybody had their way of reaction or sleep or whatever it was just to get by. But then we realized that this is going on longer than what we thought, maybe. And so I need to be able to put my health as a priority. And I need to get active, because we also know that so many people have issues with anxiety and depression, and this has magnified that. So thankfully we got the go ahead for phase 2 in order to be able to do some training outside, and as well with them allowing us to increase the amount of people that we're allowed to have, we were able to hit up more people. So we've now just started doing some outdoor boot camps. So we have those available. We're trying to hold 2 to 3 of those outdoor boot camps a week. We've started kids classes, which is awesome. Our first one was just this past Tuesday. It was a huge success. The kids loved it. And I feel like that's been a big stress for people as well, for parents, trying to keep their kids motivated. We do mountain climbers, and we do hop and drags. I would just encourage people to get up, get moving, and give it a whirl. And I think you'd be pleasantly surprised.
Well, just a few years after Ontario started allowing pot shops to open in the province, Muskoka will likely soon see its first shops opening very soon. According to the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, 4 potential stores have put in applications for licenses to sell marijuana. These locations have been publicly announced as 6 Brunel Road and 96 Main Street East in Huntsville. There will also be 2 locations in Bracebridge on Taylor Road and Manitoba Street. YourTV has learned the majority of these shops are aiming to open in July. However, no hard dates have been officially released yet. YourTV will be meeting with the separate owners of the 2 potential shops in Huntsville very soon. We're back to the break, but stay tuned for today's headline recap coming up next. Back, and here's our quick recap of today's headlines. 1 new case of COVID-19 near Severn Township. A man in his 50s confirmed to have the virus. Immunologist Mark Cameron says Ontario and Canada seem to be on a good track to keep virus activity low while we're reopening the economy. And pot shops are opening in Muskoka. Catch more of the story later this week and in the coming weeks. And that's Cogeco News. For more information on the program, head over to yourtv.tv or connect with us on social media by searching YourTV Muskoka. And remember to watch us live at 5 Monday to Thursday. From everyone here at Cogeco News, thanks for watching. Have a good night.